Masherbrum is a fearsome, imposing mountain located in the Karakoram Range in northern Pakistan, standing at a height of 7,821 meters at its peak. Masherbrum's imposing, spire-like twin-peaked appearance truly sets it apart from the other great mountains that surround it. Masherbrum was first officially noted during the Great Trigonometrical Survey of British India in the 1800s, which surveyed the most prominent peaks in the Karakoram Range from Mount Haramak, where the most prominent peaks of the Karakoram were given a designation of K for Karakoram and a number based on their prominence. Masherbrum was the most prominent peak noted during this survey, which earned it the designation of K1, although it is in actuality lesser in overall height than K2, the second tallest mountain on the planet, which stands at a height of 8,611 meters at its summit and holds an infamous and deadly reputation amongst the mountaineering community. However, while K1 has been largely overlooked by most climbers due to its fairly close proximity to several of the 14 8,000 meter peaks on the planet, including K2 and the Masherbrum Range, Masherbrum has silently remained one of the most difficult mountains on the planet to successfully ascend, on par with the most difficult to ascend mountains I've covered on the channel thus far, the Trango Towers and Bantha Brock. As the late mountaineering legend David Lama, who I also made a video about on the channel, described of the still, to this day unclimbed northeast face of the peak, quote, "It's like the north face of the Eiger with a Cerro Torre on top of it. The headwall that starts at 7,000 meters must be one of the highest and hardest headwalls in the world," he said. Lama's teammate, an elite mountaineer named Hans-Björg Auer, would also state of the mountain's difficulty, quote, "Masherbrum is extremely dangerous. You cannot try it every year. If you do, you won't come home someday," Auer described of the peak. Lama and Auer would launch their own attempt at the summit of the peak via the northeast face. However, the team would only make it 400 meters up the mountain from base camp before they were forced to call it quits, and both David Lama and Hans-Björg Auer would unfortunately lose their lives in another mountaineering incident before they were able to give it another go. Masherbrum was first successfully ascended in the year 1960 by American mountaineering legends George Irving Bell, Willie Unzeld, and Nicholas Clinch, who followed a route up the southeastern face of the peak to reach the summit successfully, the first successful ascent since attempts to reach its summit began in 1938. Since the first successful summit of K1 in 1960, only a small handful of mountaineers have even attempted to reach its summit. As of the time of making this video, the last successful teams to reach the summit did so during the summer of 1985, when a Japanese team managed to reach the summit via a new unclimbed route, while an Austrian team following the 1960 ascent route reached the summit the following day. The three aforementioned ascents of the peak actually comprise 3/4 of the successful teams that have reached the summit as of making this video, with the fourth successful ascent of the peak, which would be chronologically the second ascent of the peak, which took place in 1981, being the topic of today's video. In the summer of 1981, a 9-member Polish expedition team, led by Piotr Milotecki, geared up for an attempt at the summit of K1, planning to ascend the peak via a similar but new route, seeking to reach the slightly shorter but still unclimbed southwest summit of the mountain, which tops out at an altitude of 7,806 meters, just 15 meters below Masherbrum's true summit. On August 13th, the team established their base camp on the Sarak Glacier at an elevation of 14,100 feet, where the team immediately set to work establishing camps along their route, setting their Camp 1 at an elevation of 17,400 feet 2 days later on August 15th. The Polish expedition team continued to take advantage of the relatively calm weather window they had arrived during, pushing further up the mountain to establish their Camp 2 near the top of the dome at an elevation of 20,850 feet. However, this favorable weather window wouldn't last, and the team was forced to retreat to base camp to wait out the storm systems, which would continuously batter Masherbrum slopes for the span of nearly an entire month, as the team was only able to set their Camp 3 at an elevation of 21,500 feet on September 14th. However, the very next day, on September 15th, the team was able to successfully establish their Camp 4 at an altitude of 23,300 feet, thanks to the help of West German solo climber Volker Stahlbaum, who would abandon his own attempt at the summit not long after. The following day, on September 16th, 3 members of the expedition team would make a push for the summit: a man named Marek Malatinsky, a man named Zygmunt Heinrich, and a man named Przemysław Nowacki. The weather that morning was not ideal for a summit push, as the men trudged up the steep upper section of K1 slopes, whilst a fresh layer of powder snow began to fall from the skies, accompanied by a slight wind. Despite this, the trio of men continued on towards the summit as they slowly but steadily made their way up a section of difficult ice climbing, which had only increased in difficulty since the first ascent of 1960, reaching the col between the main summit and the southwestern summit in the late afternoon. By the time they had reached this point, the 3 men were exhausted and knew that the final push to the summit would also be a grueling affair that would likely take hours, and so the men instead opted to bivvy in snow holes for the night and planned to make a push for the southwestern summit the following morning. The next day, on September 17th, 1981, the trio of climbers again prepared for another arduous day of climbing to reach the summit. The weather conditions this day were ideal for a summit push, with clear, cloudless skies and shining sun. As they were ascending the final pitch to the summit, the team found that the climbing conditions were even more difficult and challenging than they had expected, as the men made slow and labored progress towards the summit, contending with a barrage of falling chunks of ice from the seracs that hung ominously above them. After 7 hours of exhausting climbing, at approximately 3:30 p.m., the 3 men reached the southwestern summit in triumph, spending 40 minutes together atop the summit, taking pictures and resting to regather themselves for the upcoming descent. However, not long after the trio of men began their descent, the weather suddenly began to shift from the warm, sunny, cloudless weather to cold with fierce winds that blew in looming storm clouds along with them. As the men made their way down the summit ridge, Malatinsky, who was leading the group, was struggling to see anything in the now whiteout conditions, while Heinrich, who was at the rear, struggled with similar visibility issues caused by the whiteout conditions and wandered astray from the other 2 men. As Malatinsky and Nowacki continued their descent, suddenly Malatinsky slipped, causing the pair to plummet approximately 35 feet. Both men were uninjured from the fall, but badly shaken up from their near brush with death, and so they decided to bivvy right where they had fallen for the night, opting to continue their descent in the morning. Meanwhile, Heinrich had wandered quite some distance from the others, finding himself on the lee side of the ridge, where, now sheltered from the freezing, whipping winds, he too decided to bivvy for the night. The following morning, on September 18th, Heinrich emerged from his bivvy after a horrific, freezing night to find that the weather conditions, while still stormy, were no longer whiteout conditions, and so he made his way back to the side of the ridge that he had become separated from Malatinsky and Nowaki on. As he located the men's bivvies and peered inside them, he was shocked to find that both of his teammates had frozen to death over the course of the frigid night, as unlike Heinrich, they had been at the full mercy of the icy winds, unprotected by the ridge and exposed to the full fury of the elements. As Heinrich mourned the loss of his teammates and deliberated on what he should do about their bodies, the weather again began to take a turn for the worse, and so, aware that he would share in their fates if he stuck around much longer, Heinrich decided to continue his descent back to Camp 4 alone, which would entail braving the treacherous ice cliffs that had taken the team of 3 nearly an entire day to ascend alone. As he slowly and methodically worked his way back towards Camp 4 whilst descending the ice cliffs, at an altitude of approximately 24,600 feet, Heinrich lost his traction on the wall and slipped, plummeting approximately 1,000 feet down the ice cliffs, coming to rest at their feet. However, rather miraculously, Heinrich did not perish due to the fall and suffered only minor injuries as a result, and he was able to continue his descent to Camp 4, where upon his arrival he informed the team of the other 2 men's fates. The expedition team were aware that the treacherous and unpredictable conditions high on Masherbrum slopes would make recovering the 2 bodies an impossibility, and so, over the following 2 days, the team made the retreat back to base camp, reaching it on September 21st. This Polish expedition team remains, to this day, the only people who have ever set foot atop the southwestern summit of K1, as their route has never been successfully repeated. Thank you all for watching.